Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about how to read an architectural scale. Now, what is an architectural scale? An architectural scale is a ruler used to create scale drawings. These drawings could be in a 2D plan, it could be in a 3D plan, and they basically help you take real world tools and real world representations and scale them down to the paper size or the model size that you are using for your project. So today we have to stretch our minds because I remember when I was a student and I was always asked to draw items to scale, and it was a look of confusion, frustration, embarrassment. But today we are going to learn how to do it the right way. So in a perfect world, everyone uses the metric system. So the United States has used the imperial system since its creation, and quite frankly, I don't know why we still use a system that the rest of the world is kind of turning their backs on. But for the purposes of this video and for videos to come, we are going to discuss how to use the imperial architectural scale. The architectural scale is used in a multitude of professions, and it is a ruler that is 12 inches in length. It has 12 divides as well, and typically when you see an architectural scale, it will be in a kind of triangular format. And when I think about all of these different 12 divides, I tend to notice that for landscape designers and architects, that the 1/4 inch equals 1 foot, the 1/8 inch equals 1 foot, the 16th inch equals 1 foot, and the 1/2 inch equals 1 foot scale are typically the scales that are used to demonstrate sections, elevations of buildings, structures, and even planting plans. That's not to say that other scales are not used, but for consistency in the profession, those are the scales that I typically see. To dive a little deeper, choosing the right scale is really reliant upon the type of drawing that you're going to be creating. For site plans in the landscape architecture profession, 1/16 of an inch equals 1 foot is typically the scale that is used. And if you have a little bit more of a bigger site, 1 inch equals 40 feet might be a scale to use to demonstrate services or reference points on a site plan. And if we jump to drawings, 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot is typically what is used in sections, section elevations, or any perspective drawings that one can use for their project. So let's take a closer look. If we use the example of 1/2 inch equals 1 foot, and we take our architectural ruler and look at the right hand side, we can see this interval between the 0 and the 1/2, and we notice that all of the marks total 24 marks. And if we think of this interval as a scaled ruler, we can think of each mark as a representation of 1/2 of an inch. So now let's look at 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. Similar to the previous example, if we look at this side of our ruler, we notice that the interval between 0 and 1/4 has a total of 12 marks. So we can think of each mark as an equivalent of 1 inch and use that interval to determine where our distances are along the scale. Now, the third example would be to use 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot. And if we look at the distance between the 0 and the 1/8 mark, it has a total of 6 marks. So for that, we can look at the scaled ruler example and notice that each one mark between this interval is equivalent to 2 inches. Now let's practice. The exercise for this page is to measure out where you think 8 feet and 2 inches would be located on the 1/8 scale. Now that you've found the interval, you can easily see that each one mark equals 2 inches. So after I reach the 8 mark on the 1/8 scale, I slightly go over that 8th mark to represent those 2 inches that can be represented in the interval that we discussed earlier. Now let's do another exercise. Let's measure out 45 feet with a scale of 1/4 inch equals 20 feet. This can be confusing because we've been using 1/4 inch equals 1 feet, but just know scales have variations. There is no one way to use a scale. You just have to use it consistently. Now that you have had time to think, let's go ahead and think about how we found this distance. If we used our scaled ruler on the side, we notice that between the 0 and 1/4 are 12 marks, so each one mark equals 1 inch. So if we go and find 45 on the 1/4 inch scale, it would actually go past the 2 mark and halfway between the 2 and 3rd mark on the actual scale. That measures out 45 feet with a scale of 1/4 inch equals 20 feet. Because remember, every 1/4 inch is equal to 20 feet. So if we notice that our 1/4 inch is 20 feet and we need to show 45 feet, that means we're going to go past the 2 intervals here and reach halfway between the 2nd and the 3rd interval. Now let's do some real world practice. The first thing I did was pulled out my ruler and found the real measurements. I measured this stand to be 50 inches in height. So I decided to go with a scale of 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. This obviously is not an entire neighborhood or a plan, it is just one object. I then moved to the 3rd step and converted my real measurements to scale. Now I am going to measure the width of the stand. The stand measured 36 inches in the real measurements. Because I'm using the same scale as we used before, which is 1/4 an inch equals 1 foot, I will be taking that 36 inches and dividing it by 12. I hope these explanations and examples were really helpful. It's important to always practice using your scale and being creative with how you want to represent your design. Until next time, bye.